Welcome, everyone, to the 8th installment of Writing to Influence, a public writing series. I'm James Van Wyk. I'm an assistant dean for professional development in the Office of the Dean of the Graduate School here at Princeton University. And it's been my great pleasure to coordinate this series in concert with Princeton University Press. GradFUTURES, as I hope all of you are aware by now, is Princeton's graduate student professional development hub. We are all things professional development from before graduate students decide to choose Princeton until after they leave and everywhere in between. We're here to help empower graduate students to seek out and secure the futures that they can imagine for themselves, whether that's tenure track, administrative roles, or careers beyond the academy. We're now in our 4th year of existence, and it's really great to grow out partnerships with our colleagues at offices that are very closely associated with Princeton, but are their own thing. And that one of those partners is Princeton University Press, which is an independent nonprofit. If you're interested in working at an independent nonprofit like Princeton University Press, please check out our Social Impact Fellowship program, gradfutures.princeton.edu/impact. You can get a funded experiential opportunity at a place like PUP. We have about 50 to 60 partners. PUP is one of them. But for today's purposes, PUP is also one of our main partners in putting together the series. And I'm really thrilled to introduce today's speaker. Dr. Betty Lai will be my colleague from Princeton University Press, Akil. Akil, take it away.
Yeah, great. Hi, everybody. It's great to be here. My name is Akil. I'm program coordinator at PUP Speaks, which is kind of the speaking agency at Princeton University Press. And it is my honor to introduce the wonderful Dr. Betty S. Lai. Betty S. Lai is a scholar with insights not only in her own field of psychology, but also into the state of scholarship as it stands today. As an associate professor in counseling psychology at Boston College, her research focuses on the impacts of the climate crisis and disasters on children, examining the mental and physical health consequences of large-scale disasters. Dr. Lai is also dedicated to training the next generation of scholars. Her book, The Grant Writing Guide, A Roadmap for Scholars, includes strategies and insights gleaned from her interviews of scores of grant writing experts. Dr. Lai discusses essential skills for writing research grants, providing actionable strategies for professionals in every phase of their careers, from PhD students to seasoned researchers. And with that, I'll pass it off to Dr. Lai.
Thank you so much, Akil, and thank you all for joining today from all over the world. As I can see, I'm delighted to be part of this Writing to Influence series and to talk about grant writing, because grants are really about influence. And today, what I want to talk about is 7 myths that will hold you back as a grant writer. Because all of you, by virtue of being in this room or listening to this recording, it's clear already that you are a phenomenal writer. But what is different about grant writing, and what is it that we need to make sure that you know about in order to become a phenomenal grant writer? So with that, let me switch over to slides. I'm going to drop into the chat. There is a link here with resources. The slides are on this link, but also some additional exercises and resources that I'll highlight as we talk today. I've budgeted about 30 to 40 minutes for slides, but I will pause and let you ask questions too, because I do want you to get all of your questions answered as we move forward. So let me pull up my slides. And could you give me a reaction, an emoji, if you can see these slides? All right, looking good. Okay, so we are busting myths today, and stay tuned for the very last myth that we are busting, because it's the most important one if you want to write fundable grants. So the first myth we should talk about is this idea that grants don't matter. Many people come to this feeling and have this thought in their mind, but the data don't support this idea. So let's look at some of that data. Rice and colleagues, they did a study in 2020 where they polled 92 randomly selected institutions from around the world, and they looked at, in their promotion and tenure criteria, what mattered. And 67% of those institutions explicitly listed grant writing as a key criterion. So grant writing does matter to institutions, but maybe you're not interested in a tenure track position. As Dean Van Wyk mentioned earlier, many of us may go in different directions. So you can't live your career based on what institutions want. But what about what scholars themselves say? Well, Hayes and colleagues surveyed 4,700 researchers, and they asked them, what was a critical factor that mattered in your career? 36% of those 4,700 researchers said grant writing, that grant writing was important for their career development. Now, 36% is not 100%, but it is showing that many people feel that grant writing is a factor that can move and shape your career. But even more than that, grants get attention. I interviewed an assistant professor who is not from a grant writing field. She said that she's not in a field where grants are expected. But what she said is anytime she got a grant, that was what got written up in her annual reviews. That was what got talked about in communications at her institution. And she started to think grants mattered a lot more than people were letting on. So I say all this, but I will tell you right now that I always thought all of this was baloney. I had heard things like this, but I never invested a single moment in learning how to write a grant. I went through graduate school, I went through postdoc, never learned anything about grant writing. And I have come to realize that's because I was holding on to a lot of limiting beliefs. I really believed that grants were a waste of time. I knew how to write papers, I knew how to get those published. Why would I waste my time on grants when grants are so hard to get? I also thought, I don't need the money. I'm a social scientist. We can run studies on slim to no budgets. I'm not about the money. But deep down, I know now that I really believed that I thought nobody would fund me. I wasn't a big enough name. I didn't have enough papers, on and on and on. All I cared about actually was what this picture here is showing on the right. This is a picture I took my first day on the job as an assistant professor, because all I cared about in life was getting to teach, do research, and having a window in my office. This is the picture I took the first moment I stepped into my office as an assistant professor. You can see my purse. I literally dumped my purse down and I said, I've made it in life. But unfortunately, 2 weeks into this first job, a senior administrator met with me and he said to me, Betty, if you don't get a grant, you will not get promoted. This was devastating to me because I knew that what he was really saying was if I didn't get a grant, I wouldn't have a job in 5 to 6 years. And it was also devastating to me because I really didn't know where to start. As I mentioned, I hadn't invested any time in learning this skill. And so I felt really ashamed and overwhelmed and didn't know where to start. And I stayed with that feeling for at least 3 years. I never wrote a single grant my first 3 years on the job, even though I knew I needed to if I wanted to keep that job. So it wasn't until I found mentors and figured out where to focus that I finally submitted my first grant. But the good news is that that first grant brought in over $360,000. But even more than that, what I learned from that experience is the skills that it took to secure funding from NIH, the National Academies, and more. Because the secret about grant writing is the skills are universal. Once you learn how to write great grants, you can write grants for the funders you choose. But even more than that, what I really learned through this process is that grant writing is about the joy of doing work you care about. It is because of grants that I get to choose who I collaborate with. I get to fund phenomenal trainees. This is my team and alums at a recent conference. And don't just take my word for it. I interviewed 100 people for my book on grant writing, and I heard stories of joy over and over again. So let me give you just a few examples of some of the things people have told me that you may not have thought about in connection with grant writing. So as one example, One researcher told me that grant writing is what allowed her to finally get to live with her partner. As you all know, as scholars, we have to go where the jobs are. We have to go where the opportunities are. And she had to live apart from her partner for many, many years. But when she got her first grant, she was finally able to say, I choose where I do this work. And she chose to live in the city where her partner lived. I heard a million times over that grant writing is about being on the cutting edge of your field. Grant writing allows you to get support for new ideas that you may not have gotten to test yet. And finally, one last example. One person told me that grant writing is what finally allowed him to date. That is probably surprising. It was surprising to me. So as a psychologist, I of course said, tell me more. And what he said is, until he got his first grant, he was always worried about covering his health insurance, paying his bills, finding enough coverage for his work. Did he need to pick up another course, for example? But once he got his first grant, grant writing paid for his research time. It took all of those worries off the table, and all of a sudden, he had time to date. So that is busting our first myth that grants don't matter. We'd love to give you a second to drop into the chat. Why did you join us today? And what do you hope a grant can do for you? I'll give you just a moment. So what do you hope a grant can do for your career? Yes, fun scholarly travel to archives, absolutely. I just interviewed someone who mentioned that she's based in Canada, and as an art historian, her first 2 grants let her go to the UK and to the US to visit archives. Yes, as an international student, all of the extra costs, absolutely. Fund a survey experiment, crucial for your dissertation, and congratulations on being at this dissertation phase. Aha, and I'm starting to see some questions, which is great. I will definitely get to these questions. Getting time to write a book, absolutely, because books take a long time to write. Increasing visibility of your research, absolutely. Travel grants. These are all great and motivating reasons, and I hope you all get the support for your work. It's too important. So I'm going to move to myth number 6, and keep your questions coming because I will address them after number 6. All right, so myth number 6, funders are looking for great ideas. Again, the data do not support this idea. Let me give you some data and show you what I mean. You may have seen this article, the Ginther 2011 article. And Ginther and colleagues, they examined 83,000 NIH applications, so grants to the National Institutes of Health. And what they did is they looked at disparities in funding. Compared to white applicants, they found that Asian applicants were 4% less likely to be funded. And Black and African American applicants were 13% less likely to be funded. I read this article when I was a postdoc, and I remember feeling so much shame. What is it that me, my peers, what were we doing wrong? What did we need to learn how to do better? But I've come to realize this data doesn't actually point to individuals. It's more about the systems in which we operate in. And let me explain what I mean. There was a follow-up study to this Ginther article in 2018, and they found that Black applicants were less likely than white applicants to be at a top 100 NIH-funded institution. A top 100 institution, what that means is of all the institutions and organizations NIH funds, the top 100, they get the top amount of funding. Okay, so hold that top 100 in your mind for a moment, because that top 100 distinction really matters. Because what we know is funding flows to insiders. This pie graph is showing all of the funding that NIH gives in terms of research funding. So it represents NIH research funding dollars. This is data from 2021. And In pink, what you are seeing is the top 10% of organizations that receive research funding, how much of the pie they take. The top 10% here, this is out of about 1,100 organizations. So if you do quick math, that equates to roughly that top 100 we were just talking about. The top 100 or top 10% of organizations, they receive 70% of research funding dollars from NIH. So of all the dollars that are out there, they take 70%. So those top 10% organizations, they not only take a lot of the research dollars, they take almost all. While the bottom half, so if you look at the bottom half, they're receiving less than 5% of the research dollars. So all this to say, there is something that happens to insiders. Insiders know something about how the system works, and they are better positioned to secure those dollars. Understanding this issue really burned me up. It's the reason why I wrote the grant writing guide, because it's clear that some people have a steep advantage in grant writing. But I really believe we need to hear and fund our best ideas, not the most privileged ideas, but the best ideas that can make changes in our world. And so to do that, to understand what is it that insiders know, I interviewed 100 experts about their expertise on grant writing. What do they know about grant writing, and how can we use this to help everybody write better grants? This was a big, large-scale effort. It took a lot of hours. But what I want to say about this experience is almost everybody that I asked for an interview from, they said yes almost immediately. And I was so overwhelmed by this response. Everybody's reaction was, this is so important and we need to help each other. And I feel like that is such a testament to the world of scholarship we are all trying to create today together. So funders are not just looking for great ideas. There's something else that insiders know. But one of the things insiders know is that funders aren't looking for great ideas. They're looking for great ideas that further their mission. So when you are writing grants, one of the most important things you can do is try to understand the mission of the funder. That is your job as a grant writer, to study up on the mission of the funder. Because if you fail to do that, a poor match with a funder ends up being a really bad use of your time. Let me give you 2 examples of why that is. If you don't pay attention to match, then you can develop ideas you don't care about. For example, I interviewed someone who was in a great training program that taught people how to write something called an R03 grant. That's a type of grant at the NIH that is usually for secondary data analysis or small-scale pilot projects. But what she said to me is, that's not the kind of work I do. I don't care about secondary data analysis. So she spent about 9 months developing out an idea she didn't care about, and she ended up having to scrap it because it really didn't fit the work she was trying to do. But the good news is I've kept in touch with her, and after she scrapped that idea, she went for a much bigger grant, an R01 grant, and that was actually recently funded. So paying attention to the ideas you care about and how they fit what the funder is looking for can really matter. The second reason why you need to pay attention to match is because if you don't pay attention to match, your idea is unlikely to be funded. So to give you an example of this, I recently was working on a National Endowment for the Humanities grant. They have a Public Scholars Fellowship. And I was really excited about this grant because I'm working on a book on public scholarship. And I thought, what a great fit. I'm perfect for them. We both need each other. We're a great match. But I talked to the program officer and he told me, well, this fellowship is only for books geared to non-scholars, but my book is for scholars. And he said, even if reviewers like your work, we will not fund it. So really paying attention to match is a good use of your time. And I saw that, let's see, it is, someone here is working on a book and looking for these types of grants that can fund book manuscripts is a great use of your time. So that match piece really matters. And one way to fast track your understanding of match with a funder is to pay attention to something that I call the usual suspects. I didn't coin this term, of course, but usual suspects are funders that are likely to love your work, finding good targets for your work. There are many ways to do this, and some ideas for you are searching up the chain. So who are scholars you admire? Who funds their work? Those are probably good targets for you because you like their work, funders like their work, so funders can probably be tipped to like you as well.
Jalousie, c'est le nom donné à ce pain aisément porté par les dames. Les pains ne se choisissent pas au hasard.
All right. I think I am back on unmute. Let me just check.
Sorry about that.
Thank you. No worries. Okay, the other thing you can do is search in-house. So for example, who has funded work recently at Princeton? So paying attention to press releases, those are possible good funders for you. Starting to look at funders themselves. So for example, if you're working on a book manuscript, National Endowment for the Humanities often funds time for book manuscripts. What kinds of announcements are they putting out? Are those things that you could target? You can also look within. What are organizations that you typically interact with? Do they have any grants? And could those be good targets for you? And then paying attention to your research administration offices. So what advice do they have for you? Meet with your research administrators. They can be very helpful to you. So that was busting myth 6. I want to turn over to questions. Peter, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Yeah, sure. The question I have is, I've been 32 years out of grad school, and I want to write a book. I'm quite concerned whether people wouldn't say, come on, go and rest on your pension. That would come next year. And but it's intriguing to think of, oh my goodness, I haven't even thought about grant writing. So I'm very pleased, and thanks to James and to you, of course, for actually getting introduced into this topic, which I would have otherwise never looked at. So, but I don't know whether not being a scholar in academia at the moment, whether that actually helps, or is that an impediment to being possibly awarded a grant or not, or being even eligible to apply.
Yeah, thank you so much, Peter. This is a great question. So there are definitely grants you can apply for, and you are never too late. And as I'll mention later, you're never too early either. The best time to submit and write a grant is now. You give yourself the best chance for getting a grant. And actually, Peter, the best way to figure out what could be good targets for you are to look at other independent scholars, for example. Who is funding their work, and could you use those targets as targets for your work? So going through this usual suspects exercise will help you figure out who could be a good target for you. And just anecdotally, I'll say, having reviewed for a lot of different agencies like National Science Foundation, NIH, CIHR in Canada, WT Grip, I could go on and on. I know as a reviewer, I would be very excited about your application. You have a wealth of experience and a different perspective, and we should definitely be funding work from diverse voices in scholarship. So really playing up why you having been out for 32 years is a huge strength, I think is going to be important and a big benefit to your application. All right, so that was a great question. I don't think I've missed others yet, but feel free to flag me if I have, and feel free to keep dropping your questions in the chat, and also save time at the end for questions. So myth number 5, a good idea shouldn't take work. A lot of times people, when you're newer to grant writing, you feel like, if it's a good idea, it will strike me like lightning. We'll just know it when we see it. A good idea just appears from nowhere, and it's there. It's like a lightning strike. This is not the truth. It's not how grant writers usually experience good ideas, although sometimes people get lucky and that happens. But most good ideas take a lot of work and reshaping and pushing to develop them. So to get a sense for what makes for a great idea, it really helps to read funded samples. So this link will take you out to openly available grant samples. So I've been collating all the samples that I can find that have been funded and that are out there on the internet, because this is one of the major reasons why insiders get funded at higher rates. They have access to samples. So we need to make sure that everybody has access to samples. And if you go to this link, it's also on the webpage that I dropped the link in for earlier. You can find grant samples. And as you're reading samples, you want to pay attention to, well, what is the length of these grants? How do they convey the budget? So for example, how big of an idea do you need to have for a $100,000 grant, a $300,000 grant? What are the types of grants that people are applying to? How do people convey in the grant itself this idea of fit? Because remember, it's hard to write a great grant unless you read great grants. So I do recommend reading funded samples, and also don't waste your time reading unfunded samples. I see people sometimes get stuck in that, and it's not that unfunded samples are not helpful. It's just hard to figure out when you are trying to navigate this landscape. Why did this unfunded sample not get funded? So you'll fast track your success by focusing just on funded samples. Okay, so in addition to that, the funny thing that I often see is, as scholars, our whole work is about ideas, but rarely do we talk about how you actually generate a good idea. Where does a good idea come from? And it's funny to me that we don't actually talk about that, because it is our whole work. So let's be really explicit. What is a way to generate good ideas? I have an exercise for you that can help you. It's based around this idea, the Japanese concept of ikigai, where you focus in on your values and ask yourself, well, what does the world need? What is it you love? What are you good at? And what could you be paid for? Let me give you some examples. What does the world need? I interviewed a scholar who works in emergency departments, and she said to me that one of the questions parents kept asking her after their children attempted suicide was, am I allowed to let my kids back on social media? She really didn't know. The research didn't exist. It wasn't clear. Was that okay? Would that be harmful? Would that be helpful? So she wrote a grant to address that need. 2, what do you love? I read an article, I think it was in the New York Times, about a researcher who is an avid knitter. She loves knitting, and but she's also a mathematician. She wrote a grant on using knitting to understand surfaces. I love that. So she really leaned into what she loves and used that to generate new ideas. 3, what are you good at? What is it that people come to you and say, oh, Jennifer, can you help me with this? You're really good at this. Paying attention to the things that other people see you as an expert at can really help you generate ideas. And in grant writing, you need to showcase that you're an expert. And if people are already coming to you, asking you about an area that you're good at, that's a good sign that it could be a good area for you to write a grant in. 4th, ask what could you be paid for? This is where a lot of people think you have to start with grant writing. So what's a fundable idea? What would people pay me for? This is a fine question to ask, but I put it forth because I don't think it helps to start here, because most of us didn't become scholars because we wanted to get grants. We had big ideas about how the world works or wanted to learn about how the world works. But it's always good to get paid. So one of the concrete ways to focus on what could you be paid for is start reading announcements out of funding agencies. So for example, what is the Spencer Foundation looking for right now? They will explicitly say, we are looking for grants right now that address social justice issues, for example. So when you see that in announcements from funders, you can brainstorm ideas off of that. What kinds of work are you interested in right now that could fit with that? If you want more brainstorming stems for these areas, I have a lot of brainstorming questions in chapter 2 of the book. So let's say you go through and you generate all these great ideas off of your values. What a lot of people often come back and say is, I have no new ideas. Nothing is new under the sun. Everybody has already come up with the ideas that I just came up with. Somebody already did it. So my response is, it is a good sign. if other people are getting funded for work and ideas that you have. It's showing that you actually have fundable ideas. We just need to make sure you get your ideas out into the world and that you do it soon. But the other thing about developing great ideas is often one idea by itself isn't enough. It needs to be combined with something else. So that's what this is supposed to represent. Like one idea alone isn't enough. It needs a combination to become a really brilliant idea. So let me give you an example. I work with someone who studies Safe Care. Safe Care is a child abuse prevention program, and it works. But the problem is writing a grant to study Safe Care is not innovative or interesting because we already know it works. So why would anybody fund that? So what my colleague did is she thought about studying Safe Care, but combining it with smoking cessation programs. So all of a sudden, those two pieces together were a really novel idea, and it was funded. Let me give you another example. Somebody mentioned to me the other day, have you noticed that most motivation researchers study motivation in STEM? And I said, I didn't notice that. But now that I've thought about it, it makes sense because what's happening here is it's combining what you love, motivation research, with what you could be paid for. Because NSF, National Science Foundation, cares a lot about STEM pathways. So motivation researchers get a lot of funding from NSF because they're paying attention to how what they love about motivation could be funded by an organization that cares about STEM. All right, so that is the end of number 5. A good idea shouldn't take work. I'm not seeing new questions yet in the chat, so I will keep moving to myth number 4. A lot of times, people, when you're newer to grant writing, you feel like any feedback is helpful. I hate to break it to you, but this is not true. So what a lot of people will do, they'll make the mistake of getting feedback that is not critical. What I mean by that is feedback that looks like this. Oh, this grant is brilliant. You are so great. I love it. You are so smart. That kind of feedback is so nice. And please hold those colleagues and friends dear to your heart because they are good people. You want those people near you. They're not helping you with your grants. For grants, you must get critical feedback. The kinds of people who will say to you, this does not feel important. This is only a small step forward. Your approach seems really wrong. So the joke in grant writing is you need feedback from the people who will tell you directly that you have an ugly baby. So that's not the kindest, but those are the kinds of people you want feedback from in grant writing. Because in grant writing, the thing about grants is it's a very social process. You need people who are not you to champion your work. So you need to make sure that before your grant gets to those people, you have had it vetted so that they don't get tripped up by things that are not great about your grant. You want to polish it before they see it. Because in grant writing, the process typically works like this. You draft and polish your grant. You put in the best work you can. You submit it to your institution. And Peter, that could depend for you. But you submit it to your institution who's going to check for compliance and submit. When your grant is submitted, it typically gets routed to a program officer. And program officers are people who manage portfolios of scholarship at the funder. Those program officers secure reviews of your grant from reviewers. And then those reviews come back to the program officer, your institution, and eventually to you. So this is a social process because your grant gets evaluated by program officers, reviewers who have to advocate for your work. So you really want critical feedback before those people see your work. Okay, so that is the end of myth number 4, that any feedback is helpful. Let me take a quick pause and to answer a question that came in via DM. Is it okay to apply for multiple grants, like a combination of smaller grants in the same time period as a grad student? What's a good balance of being realistic versus casting a wide net, especially given that you need recommendations in other people's times? I love this question. It's such a good one. So the thing about grant writing, as this question is pointing out, is having more submissions out there gives you a higher chance of getting your work funded. But it comes at a cost because it's hard to develop new ideas and it takes a lot of time to write really great ideas. So there's no one easy answer to this. Like all things in scholarship, the answer is it depends. But the things to keep in mind are, as a graduate student, it's often helpful to apply to as many grants as you have bandwidth for. I asked a lot of people this exact question, and to a T, almost everybody agreed at the graduate and postdoc level, apply to as many grants as you have the bandwidth for. And the reason is every single grant you get, even if it's a small grant, improves your social proof. Meaning, every grant you write makes you more fundable to the next funder, because every time a funder sees that you got some grant, even if it's small, they can say, other people are already supporting their work. We probably should too. They've already been out there. They've already been securing grants. But this calculus changes as you get into higher levels of rank. So at the assistant professor level and above, you have to pay really close attention to what your institution values, because not all institutions value grants the same way. Let me give you an example. At my last institution, it was really important that every grant you got was a federal grant. They did not count foundation grants. So federal grants are grants funded by federal agencies. There are 26 in the United States, or they are government grants, for example, in other countries. So think CIHR in Canada, Canadian Institutes of Health Research. So federal grants, they tend to be larger. So some institutions only care about those types of grants. And you need to know that and pay attention to that. Because just for example, at my old institution that cared a lot about federal grants, I did see folks who were able to secure a lot of foundation grants who did not get promoted because they didn't secure those federal grants. So you do, in that case, have to really pay attention to where you put your time and energy, because some institutions really care about the type of grant. But the other thing that I will say is that when you are applying, sometimes you can use the same grant and apply to multiple funders. So to answer this question that I got via DM, sometimes that can be a strategy to save you on that cost piece of developing new ideas and new grants. You have to check with the funder and make sure that this is okay based on the rules, but applying to multiple funders with the same grant can be one way to up your chances. I interviewed somebody who had been continuously funded for decades, and he said this was the strategy he used for every single grant. Now, I don't do that. I don't use that strategy myself. So I just say that as an example of how in grant writing, the answer to this question of how many grants at once really depends, and depends on your job load, your work expectations, and etc. What would be the institution if you're unaligned except for being an alum? It's a great question, Peter. Sometimes you don't need an institution, so you would be targeting grants where you don't need an institution. So for example, at National Endowment for the Humanities, you don't apply through an institution, you apply as yourself. So institution is not always a part of this process. It depends on the grant itself. But I insert institution in this slide because a lot of times people forget that if you're applying for certain types of grants, your institution actually is the place that gets awarded the grant. So I'm happy to get into more of the complexities of that, but you don't always have to have the institution, to your point, Peter. So thank you for that. I will keep moving to point number 3. Myth number 3 is that your job as a grant writer is to explain what you're going to do. This is a myth. And it's what I see a lot of newer grant writers do. So they focus on what you're going to do, when in truth, you really need to focus on why you're going to do the work. That is the most important thing you should answer first. Let me give you an example. Let's say I tell you, I would like $20 million to blow up this boulder. Your first question to me should be, why? So you need to answer that question first, because check out how different it is if I answer that question first. If I say to you, this boulder is about to fall, and when it falls, it's going to destroy the grain silo for the entire community. If that happens, it's going to cost us $100 million to fix the grain silo and get the community back up to functioning. And it will take us 10 years to do so, because that's how destructive this boulder is. It's very different to start with why, because if you start with why, you can hopefully get reviewers on board with you to understand your work and root for the actual work you're going to do. Let me give you, that's kind of an abstract example, so let me give you a grant example so you can see this idea at play as well. For my first grant, I worked for a really long time to come up with this. My grant is going to model risk and resilient academic trajectories for a city directly impacted by a significant natural disaster. I loved this start to my grant. I really was giving myself a pat on the back for it, but I showed it to a program officer, I showed it to some mentors, and they said, this is honestly terrible. This is not the right place to start. So after a lot of rewriting, I finally came to this. This grant is about schools as an epicenter of recovery after disasters. If we can understand how to help schools recover from disasters, we can help communities recover from disasters. So explaining the why of the work can really help everybody be excited about and want to champion your work. All right, so myth number 2. A lot of people believe that reviewers have time to review your work in depth, and this is not true. Reviewing grants is service work. People do it on top of their regular jobs, and it's a lot of extra work. It's stuff that you have to do on the nights and on weekends outside of work hours. You often get hundreds of pages to review at a time. So reviewers are not lovingly poring over your words and appreciating the beauty of the words you have put together. So what you want to do is make sure your ideas shine. It's not the beauty of the words, it's the ideas that need to shine, because reviewers, I've asked a lot of people this question, on average, reviewers are only spending about 3.5 to 5 hours reading your grant. There's a big range in that, but that's kind of the most common answer that I've heard, 3.5 to 5 hours. So this grant that you spent months on, they are not spending a lot of time on. And when they're reading, they are just looking to see how your grant rates on review criteria. So that's the big secret in grant writing. When reviewers read a grant, they are given review criteria against which they need to evaluate your grant. That is all the information they are looking for in your grant. So let me give you an example of what I mean by review criteria. At the National Science Foundation, you can find this online. The National Science Foundation asks every reviewer to rate grants on intellectual merit and broader impacts. But they go even further and they say explicitly what that looks like and what a great grant will contain. So reviewers are looking to see, how does this grant advance knowledge? How does it benefit society? How is it potentially transformative? So as a grant writer, the best thing you can do is look up the evaluation criteria for your grant and write to those criteria. Most evaluation criteria are online. A lot of times they're published with the grant call itself. So when funders ask for applications, they will publish the evaluation criteria in that call. If not, search around to see if you can find the criteria, ask mentors, ask peers, ask them if they can help you understand how your grant will be rated. Because the more you can write to these criteria, the better your grant will be. And let me show you what I mean by that. You want to make it easy to advocate for you. So here are some criteria for a SSHRC grant. It's social sciences grant in Canada. And one of the criteria for this grant they ask people to rate on is demonstrated capacity for leadership in the research domain, rate influence in research programs, institutions, and society at large. You can make it easy to advocate for yourself by using sound bites, being concrete, and being specific. By sound bites, what I mean is, see how this says capacity for leadership? You should have a heading that says leadership capacity. Read the rules for the grant to make sure you're being compliant, but having that heading is a soundbite. It says to reviewers, here is exactly what you need. Here's what I want you to write up in your review. And they give you very clear instructions on what should be rated: research programs, institutions, society at large. So having headings that say research programs, institutions, society at large helps reviewers know here's what you need. And then you want to be concrete and specific when you are talking about these areas. So what I see new grant writers do that can hurt them in review is they'll say something very generic and vague. So for example, for society at large, I will have a great impact on society at large. This will be transformative. But there are no details on how or why or specifics. But look at how much more powerful it is if you say, in this part in green, I have over 15,000 followers. Over the past 2 months alone, my platform has generated 2.2 million views. Having really concrete evidence that's specific helps people latch onto the power and potential of what you hope to do. And it also gives reviewers something that they can talk about when they are reviewing your grant, because they'll say, oh, well, this scholar is going to make a difference. They have a platform that's generating 2.2 million views in 2 months. Okay, if you are ready for it, can you give me a emoji or some sort of reaction to let me know you are ready for the final myth? Because that is the very most important myth that we need to bust. Ha! Thank you, James. All right, here it is. You're not ready. A lot of people feel this way. It makes sense. You're not ready for any variety of reasons. But the most important factor for getting support in grant writing is to submit. We need your voice. And I never got a grant as a graduate student, as a postdoc, in my first 3 years as an assistant professor, but I should have never expected to get a grant because I never submitted. You have to submit if you want to get your work funded. On average, at the National Science Foundation, on average, people submit 2.3 grants for every grant they get funded. Rejection is part of being a grant writer, but also you have to put in work if you want to have a chance of getting funded. Because if you don't submit, nobody will fund your work. And you're never too early. Here's just one example, no matter what field you're in. So this is one person I'd interviewed. She was an MD, but she said she'd wish she'd known to apply for training grants for residents even before junior faculty grants. Grants can get you started much earlier. You don't need to delay. And you also don't need to worry that you're too late. As Peter, thank you for sharing your question, because people have this question across our careers. You know, am I at the right time? I would say that what better time than now? Thank you all for your time today. I will open up for Q&A, but just want to mention, in case you're interested in getting more tips on grant writing, I do have a free newsletter. It's totally free. I won't spam you, and you can unsubscribe anytime. But I do answer questions like this question about how many grants to apply to at a time. All right, so let me check out questions. I see a question. Let's see, I'll read this question out. A question about when I was talking about talking to a program officer who was saying that they weren't funding books for a scholarly audience. They revealed some behind the scenes expectations that weren't publicly advertised. Do you recommend reaching out to program officers, department directors to give them a soft pitch of your research to make sure it actually fits their objectives? Carrie, oh, sorry, I didn't mean to say your name. Yes, I absolutely recommend that you reach out to program officers. And there's a trick though, because you want to reach out once you already have a bit of an idea, because you don't want to reach out if you have no idea yet, because then there's not much that they can help you with. Not every program officer at every funder will meet with you. You do have to ask around to make sure that this is okay. For example, CDC, they won't meet with you to talk about your work, but at many places they will meet with you. They do want to talk about your work, because the thing to know about program officers is most people who become program officers choose to do so because they care about shaping fields. Most are scholars themselves, and being a program officer is a great way to get to mentor and get to hear the best ideas. And so they do like to meet with people. They do like to hear about where your work is at. So I usually recommend you reach out to program officers once you have a one-pager. So a one-pager is the soft pitch of your grant. It's totally acceptable and recommended to reach out to program officers because it is such a game changer. I have talked to a lot of people, as you know, about grant writing, and this was one of the #1 tips that people always recommended. They said, always talk to a program officer and always make sure you develop that relationship. So when you meet with a program officer, and I do have a script in the book for how you can reach out to program officers, what you should say. When you reach out to program officers, make sure you take notes when you meet with them, because program officers are power brokers. I remember at one point, a program officer was joking that when they became a program officer, their H index shot up because everybody was citing them. And regardless of how you feel about that practice, it is clear evidence that whole fields pay attention to program officers as power brokers. They're starting to cite program officers because they know that they really can shape the field. And so developing a relationship with a program officer is a great way to get that inside knowledge, because we all saw the data. Insiders have an advantage. And one way to tap into that cultural knowledge is to speak directly to program officers who know things that we can't know otherwise. A lot of times people are afraid to reach out to a program officer because it seems pretty intimidating, but reaching out to a program officer is very widely accepted. So you do want to check in case you have a funder where that's not allowed, but it's always okay to ask, in my opinion, because that's the only way we can figure out and learn how to navigate these funding sources. I talk to a lot of people who even go as far as always writing their program officer when they have papers published off a grant. You know, they're trying to maintain that relationship. It's a great question.
Might you give us a taste of from the book what that outreach email might look like?
Sure. Oh, thank you for asking that. So in that email, what you want to say is, dear program officer, you want to name them by name because it shows you've done your homework on the funder and you're trying to figure out that fit that we were talking about. So dear program officer, I'm really interested in applying to this type of grant. So again, you're showing you've done the homework on trying to understand how they work. Would you be willing to meet with me to talk about the programmatic fit of my work with your program? So again, you're trying to make that case for fit. And then attached is my one-pager to showcase the ideas I'm thinking about. Would you be willing to hop on a 30-minute phone call with me? Thank you so much for your time. Sincerely, Betty. So just to recap, dear program officer by name, I'm applying to this grant, and link it out because that helps them know which type of grant you're applying to. And then I'm trying to understand the programmatic fit of my work with your program. Would you be willing to meet with me for a 30-minute meeting to discuss? I've attached my one-pager. So your one-pager, again, is a short pitch for your grant. And they usually have a certain layout. I've given you a structure for it in this book. But the quick recap of what that structure looks like is it starts with the why of your grant, which probably no surprise since we've made it through our 7 myths. So why you're doing your grant, what problem you solve in the world, what exactly you will do, your mechanisms, what questions you will ask, and your broader impacts of the work. But all is one short page. It's a great question. Okay, is there any, oh, Iveta, do you want to come off mute and read your question out loud? And no worries if
Sure,
not.
yeah, I'll do that. I am not sure that my video is going to function properly, but I will read it. Is there anything, at least a code of ethics, if not, NDAs and things like that, that protects your IP when sharing your ideas early on with program officers and similar our brokers?
Yes,
You know,
this
is
is a
there
great
concern about your idea somehow being taken over by someone?
It's a great question and a big concern, of course, because we deal with ideas, so we have to protect our ideas. I will say I've been lucky. I've been a scholar since 2005. I have never had an idea stolen, in my opinion. And, you know, I could be lucky because you do hear many scholars who say that people have stolen their work. So I asked a lot of people this question in interviews because I know it's a common concern. And what folks said is, before you share your work with a peer or a senior mentor, make sure it's someone that people trust. So talk to your whisper networks and ask around, is this somebody who really cares about mentorship and supporting folks in their career? Can I trust them? So pay attention to that and ask around about that before you share your work with someone you don't know. And hopefully you already have in your network lots of people you do trust, so you know that you can feel comfortable sharing with them. With program officers, they see so many ideas and they themselves don't usually write grants. So I feel like that concern there is mitigated. But what I will say more generally is, at the end of the day, a really great grant comes out of your values, your ideas, your training, your perspectives. Nobody can truly take that idea because it is so unique to who you are as a scholar. Now, could somebody hear your idea on maybe, you know, basketball and mathematics and do a take on that from theirs? That's possible, but it won't be quite your idea. And so I would say that I don't see people stealing ideas so often. I haven't seen it in my experience, but I do read that it happens. I don't want to negate that it can happen, but the best way to mitigate that risk is only share with colleagues that you either trust directly or have heard you can trust. And on the program officer side, that concern gets mitigated because they literally read thousands of grants and they don't submit themselves. So they're, in my opinion, much less likely to do this. It's a great question.
Thank you.
Any other questions? I do want to point out, because that question came up about as a graduate student, and also people mentioned in the chat being international graduate students, I linked out a post about finding graduate student opportunities. Johns Hopkins has a great repository where they also list out criteria. For example, if you are an international student, which grants can you qualify for? So hopefully those can be good resources for you as you search for possible opportunities.
There's a question I like to ask, Betty. Knowing what you know now, if you could transport yourself back to graduate school, and let's say you're in the dissertation phase, let's say you're to you know, second or third year, and you're just starting dissertation phase. One of the myths I see graduate students buying into is that time is a zero-sum game, which is to say that, oh, if I take away time from my research and I apply for this grant, that's time that I'll never get back. And it's a myth that is helped along by our advisors who might say, you don't have time to do that, just focus on your work. Can you go back to yourself in that moment with the knowledge you have now and say, here's what you should have done? And by doing so, help a lot of the PhDs on the call think about ways they might reframe their own approach to time, applying for grants, and dissertating. Because the dissertation is like gas. It'll always take up the shape of the container you give it, right?
This is such a great question. I would say from my perspective now, a lot of people worry that grants are wasted time. I know I worried about this. This is why I'd never worked on grants. But grants, even rejected grants, are not a waste of time because you can still put them on your CV. A rejected grant shows you have figured out how to put together a grant application. And that is really promising. I've sat on so many search committees over the years, and people do pay attention to your rejected grants as well, because they show that you are trying to figure out that match to funder. You're trying to figure out how funding agencies work. And as I've mentioned, this is a process. It takes a lot of time to study and get to know people across different funding agencies. So you putting in that work is great evidence that you are understanding how this landscape works, and that eventually you will be successful. Because one of the things we know about grants is it's a numbers game. You have to put in applications to get to that successful application. And you having already had unsuccessful applications is really good evidence of your potential. The other thing is, even grants that are not funded, they can be broken off into concept papers. You know, I have some grants that just never made it anywhere, but I never felt like it was lost work because I used it for another application. I was able to break off pieces. I was able to write a concept paper. I talked about it in my annual reviews. So there are always opportunities to use what you've learned from writing the grant. And that zero-sum game, I think, is a really important concept, because grant writing is literally just a skill. We can all get better at it. So the time you put into it is time you're investing in your development. You get better at these skills as you do more, and it helps you be a better writer across the board. I spent a lot of time today talking about how grant writing is different, just because I know all of you on the call are very fortunate to get to hear from lots of different writers. And so I wanted to focus on what is unique about grant writing, but investing time in grant writing, I know, has made me a better writer across other areas as well.
Yeah, that's great. And the other question, which is maybe, I think you touched on it here and there, but rejection. So you get rejected. What's your immediate next step?
Okay, I love this question. When you get rejected, you should definitely mourn and feel that feeling, because it's a real feeling. And I think sometimes we don't let ourselves as scholars sit with both the joys and the lows, and a rejection is a true low. So as a psychologist, I say very important to name that feeling and feel it, because you invested a lot of your time and effort into something that you were proud of. So definitely mourning that moment. But then after that, after you get some distance, talk to friends, talk to colleagues, but also know you're in very good company. We all get rejected all the time. I'll give you just one example. There's a great video with Dr. Carol Greider, who won a Nobel Prize. And she talks about how on the day she found out she's winning the Nobel Prize, she also found out that she had a grant that was rejected. So if Dr. Carol Greider can get a Nobel Prize and handle a rejection, you are in very good company with your rejections. We all get rejected. And the biggest factor that matters in grant writing is picking yourself up and trying again.
Yeah, that's great. And I think maybe it could be part of the strategy too, of like when you're applying for a grant, if it's only this one really niche organization that could potentially take that kind of application, and you can't imagine, okay, if they don't fund it, who else could I apply to? Maybe that's part of the calculus of saying, maybe I should, you know, not write a niche one-off application and not have a list of who would this go to next. I get the application, I mourn, I like that term. I mourn a bit, but I know that my plan is to then send a very similar version of that application to a very similar kind of funding agency, rather than saying, well, that was, you know, that was that.
Yes, yes, I absolutely agree with that. And it's the very same rationale that makes people not apply to certain funders that won't give feedback. Because the thing is, not every funder will give feedback. And so it can end up not being a great learning experience if you don't get reviews back, you just get the rejection. So some people also take that into account when deciding where to apply to. I will say that from my own perspective, you know, I talked about usual suspects list. And, you know, for most grants I write, I have a short list of 5 or 6 funders that could possibly fund this work. To your point, James, that, you know, being able to know that this grant will have other opportunities if not this funder.
Tremendous. Any last questions for Professor Lai? Well, there's some really kind words in the chat. Peter had to leave. Thanks for a great presentation. Learned something really useful. And notes, this has been so tremendously helpful. Thank you so much for sharing your time and knowledge. Have to run, but we'll definitely subscribe to the newsletter. Thank you coming in from Pablo. The book for graduate students here at Princeton, we have some copies in the GradFUTURES Hub. So make an appointment to talk to Sonali and I and mention the book, and we'll be sure to get you a copy. I want to give a plug for the GradFUTURES Forum, which kicks off April 5th with a fellowships and internships fair. And then the following week, the whole week is chock full of events. So stay tuned, gradfutures.princeton.edu/forum. It's open to all, including alums and those of you who are joining us from other institutions. So thanks so much, Professor Lai. The thank yous are rolling in. If there's nothing else, I want to just really reiterate how grateful we are to have books like these in graduate school. Is tough enough without having to discern the hidden curriculum of graduate school. And this is an important book that lays bare some of the long hidden secrets behind grant writing. And so it's important work, and I'm really appreciative of the time and care you put into crafting this presentation. It was tight. There was no wasted moments, and really grateful for your book and for the entire Skills for Scholars series in which it sits at Princeton University Press. So thanks, everyone. Really appreciate you coming out on this Thursday. And thanks again to Professor Lai, sorry.
Thank you all so much for this opportunity. It was a privilege.